Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Great to be together with you again, and I just want to thank you, particularly those of you who have been helping to promote the show, sending out links to friends and talking to folks about it. Very much appreciate that, and I can see the results. I know I'm a little obsessive about looking at the downloads, but that's just how it is in the wonderful world of podcasting. I also want to spend just a moment telling you about a daily television show that Susan and I do. And here's the best thing about it. You don't even need to have cable television because you can watch it online any time you wish. How do you watch our daily TV show? Well, you go to our website, rabbidaniellapin.com, and then on the main homepage of the website, you just scroll down a little bit till you come to television show, and you click on that, and you're taken right over to tct.tv, where you can look at the 4 or 5 shows we're broadcasting that week, and you can just pick whichever ones you want to watch. It's a 30-minute show. And it's called Ancient Jewish Wisdom with Rabbi Daniel Lapin, and it's Susan and I. And the good thing about it, I think, is that it's not scripted. Susan and I know what we're talking about. We know what the topic is. We have determined the approach. We've determined which particular biblical verses are applicable and how. But then from there, it's come as it goes. and every now and then we disagree and we hammer that out. But for the most part, it's all in good spirits, and we try and provide a very real service there in exposing you not only to a real life question, but how it's tackled and where the approach actually comes from. So it's called Ancient Jewish Wisdom with Rabbi Daniel Lapin, but the easiest way to get to it is just to go to our website, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, and scroll down till you come to television show, click on that, and you get right there. So at any rate, if you enjoy the podcast, you probably will also find the television show interesting. Now, the other thing I have to tell you is that today's show is actually a replay of one from before the 2016 election. It was from the summertime, and Susan and I were actually boating in a small boat off the coast of British Columbia, and we had different ones of our children joining us from time to time. And then I did the podcast from there. So here is a show from that period. It's a time when Obama is still in the White House, and I interview a very interesting woman. She's a nurse in an intensive care unit in a big city hospital. And if you ever wondered why Obamacare was unsustainable, what it looks like from the front lines, and the horrific circumstances that a highly trained young nurse has to put up with because of illegal immigration and the cultural qualities that enable growing parts of America's population to use an emergency room at the hospital as the first recourse in the event of any kind of medical issue of any kind at all. Anyway, she talks candidly. We conceal her identity, but you will very quickly realize that she knows what she's talking about. And then we're also going to talk about, on this show, a number of things that I haven't gone back to, and I think that you'll find interesting. The abortion of girls not only in China, but also in Manhattan, the differences between lesbianism and homosexuality, between women and men, and number of other male-female issues that I don't get to very often. So it's one of the shows I'm most enthusiastic about, and I realize that many of you who've joined in the last few years would not have heard this show. So there it is, and one of the reasons I'm replaying it is because on the day when I ordinarily would have prepared this podcast this week, we were busy taping the television show. So that's why I mentioned the TV show, and so I thought I would give you this one, and I sure hope you like it. If a whole lot of you say, "Oh, come on, stop feeding us all that old stuff," then I don't know what will happen, but tell me if that's the case, and at least I'll know that's something should not happen again. At any rate, the resource for this week that we're highlighting is called the Biblical Blueprint Set. You'll see it at rabbidaniellapin.com, where you'll also be able to subscribe to our free weekly emails. You can also send an Ask the Rabbi question. The last Ask the Rabbi question actually was from a woman who is in the dating pool, and she had some questions about men that she's encountering. So that is up on the website in the Ask the Rabbi section, all at rabbidaniellapin.com. Okay, let's move right on with the show then, and very much hoping you enjoy it. This is your rabbi thinking of you as we move into the show, recorded actually on a boat in the waters of British Columbia. Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back, everybody. Your rabbi, that's me, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, reminding you that the more that things change, the more we need to depend upon those things that never change. Thanks for listening to the show, and we're delighted to be here on The Blaze, and I'm grateful to you for participating and for listening. And who better than a rabbi to tell you about the things that never change? Because the more clear we all are upon those things that never change, the better equipped we are to deal with all the stuff that does change around us. And here is something that never changes. One of the things that never changes is that people do get sick, people want to be healthy, and that people need medical care. And this will be the last week of the podcast that is recorded on a small boat that my wife and I are navigating off coastal British Columbia. And one of the charming aspects, I mean, we love so much about this lifestyle, but one of the great things we enjoy is that we pull into small harbors. Sometimes they're fishing villages. Sometimes they're small places that have economies based on lumber or tourism, but small places. And you go up you find the dockmaster, and you pay a few dollars of dockage fee, and then you go over to the inevitable coffee shop that's at the end of the dock, and it's never a name brand coffee shop. And you know who I mean. I'm not going to mention them by name because they're not advertisers on our show, so I'm not going to give them free advertising. But no, it's never any of those. It's usually some local coffee. So it's always a pleasure. And here's the best part. You run into people, and because it's a small village and because you've arrived by boat, people talk and people converse, and we invariably end up inviting people back to the boat for a drink of something and then a chance to sit and talk. Well, one of the people that I met this morning was an absolutely charming young woman who works as a nurse. She's a very highly qualified nurse. I'm going to give her I'm going to withhold information about her identity because I want her to be able to talk freely. But she's a nurse in a large American city hospital, and I'll just leave it at that. But she had so much to say. She was so fascinating in terms of the inside view of what really goes on. Is Obamacare working? Is medicine getting better and better? Is the illegal immigration policy of this country working really well? when you are a nurse on the floor of a major hospital, I do believe you know more about what's going on than any doctor does. And Nurse Michelle Jeffries, RN, that means registered nurse, is living proof of that. She knows so much. And I thought to myself, I've got a few minutes time with her before I go on and do the rest of this podcast. And I thought this will be fun to chat with her for a few minutes. And I know that it was something that you would enjoy hearing about as well. So, first of all, then, Nurse Michelle, thank you for spending a little bit of time with me on our boat, and I hope you're having a wonderful vacation as well. And let's start off with the sort of wards you work on in this hospital, what sort of hours, and also a little bit about your training.
Well, thank you for having me on your beautiful boat. This is very enjoyable. I was trained. I have a 4-year bachelor's degree. And then I went back to school and I did a 15-month highly intensive program that graduated with a registered nurse degree and a bachelor's in nursing. So it's quite a bit of schooling I've had. And I now work in a very busy city hospital, as you mentioned, on a very acute floor. So patients coming in from the emergency room, as soon as they're stabilized, are sent up to a floor like mine, the one that I work on.
And again, I will just ask your forbearance, all of you, because you will hear the noise of boats puttering by, or you might hear seagulls, or you might even hear the odd seaplane landing literally outside the windows of our boat. So do be aware of that, and forgive us for that. But meanwhile, Nurse Michelle, I suppose I wanted to start off by asking you this. Everybody, I've got to think you go into nursing with a certain aspect of altruism, a certain desire to do something meaningful and to make a difference and to help. And certainly, all the nurses I've ever met, and you are a glowing example of this, radiate a genuine care for people who are under their treatment. So I guess I want to ask you, are there any ways in which you've had cold water dashed in your face? Are there any ways in which life now on the floor in your ward, and you say to yourself, this is not what I signed up for. There's a lot here that I don't like. I never knew. I did not know that nursing would involve this. Or has everything been just as you expected?
I wish I could say that everything's been as I expected, but I definitely went into nursing very bright-eyed and maybe with colored sunglasses on, thinking that it would be a lot of, just really caring for people who genuinely needed my help and making a difference to people who, really had nowhere else to turn at some of the worst times of their lives. And while there definitely are those moments, unfortunately, I would have to say they're rather few and far between. On a typical day, I have somewhere between 6 and 7 patients, and I would say out of those patients, there's probably 1 or 2 of those patients who really need me and are in the hospital for what I would call the right reasons. I've come to realize over the 5 or so years that I've been in this hospital, it's a busy city hospital. We care for a lot of different types of people, but a lot of the people coming in are drug seeking, which I you're not really supposed to say. But I've had patients tell me honestly that they're there, because they want painkillers. Patients are typically very honest with me. I have a good relationship with all my patients for the most part, and they'll tell you that they came in to get a certain type of drug, and very honestly will tell me that if the doctor's not willing to prescribe them what they want, they'll simply turn around and come right back in the emergency room and go to a different floor where a different attending will be willing to prescribe them what they're looking for. And just listening to this, the cost, I don't know the exact cost of what it costs a taxpayer every time a patient is admitted to an emergency room and then placed on a floor, but it cannot be cheap because they're billing them for every little thing. When the breakdown of the bill is, putting in an IV is a certain bill, and, the changing of the sheets is a certain bill, and hanging a bag of IV fluid is a few $100s. And there's no even thought about the cost. They'll tell me I'll go right back down to the emergency room, or I'll go to one of the other numerous hospitals in the city. And that's just the reality. I've met a lot of the patients are coming in like that with no really regard for how much it's going to cost. And then you'll have patients who are coming in on their own private insurance, and they are literally dying to get out of the hospital. I mean, they could be still very, very sick, and they'll be begging us to discharge them because they know what kind of bill they're going to be racking up. Compared that with someone who knows that they won't be on the receiving end of the bill, we've had patients stay for months at a time just because they don't want to leave.
So let me just try and drill down to what I think I'm hearing under the surface. Let me ask you this first of all. I got to think that if I'm, God forbid, if I have to be in a hospital, I've got to think that somebody like you must be a ray of sunshine. Doctors have been in there, they've had their little meetings and their consultations, and then you come in and you talk to me like a human being and you make me feel better. I think I would be overflowing with gratitude toward you. So my question is, if this is a fair question at all, could you say what percentage of your patients typically radiate gratitude to you, and what percentage, if any, radiate a sense of entitlement, which usually comes with a sense of resentment, and a sort of demanding attitude rather than a grateful attitude? I'd love to hear you on that.
There are definitely patients who are very grateful, and those patients are lovely to take care of. They really feel appreciative of all the help that they're getting, and they're grateful for the smallest thing. But I would say that the majority of the patients that I take care of come in with a very large sense of entitlement, and make it a lot more difficult to take care of them. But a lot of them really are very entitled. We'll have, patients demanding things, and that I would say is the biggest difference between what I expected coming out of nursing school and what the reality is, because so much of my time that I really need to take care of patients who are genuinely sick and need help is taken up by demands from patients who don't honestly need to be in the hospital in the first place. A lot of just time-consuming activities, things that they demand. There's no thank you, there's no please, just a lot of trivial matters that they want dealt with, which comes with no manners or anything at all. And really it takes up a lot of time that I thought coming out of nursing school would be devoted to taking care of patients who really need my help.
So as a nurse, Michelle, do you know whether a patient in front of you has private insurance, or whether this is a patient who walked through the door with no insurance, with no nothing at all? And as I understand it, legally an emergency room has to take somebody regardless of whether they have any insurance, regardless of whether they have any money. But by the time a patient makes it to your floor, do you know who is an insurance patient and who's going to be paying for their stay, and who is an indigent patient who's going to walk out of the door without having paid a penny, or without any insurance that would cover any of the costs? Do you know?
I do know, and I have to say that it wouldn't make a difference to me the way that I take care of them. I would take care of all my patients the same way, regardless of whether they're coming in with private insurance, whether they're paying out of pocket, because we do have those patients as well who are paying in cash, or patients who are coming in and being taken care of by taxpayer money. It wouldn't make a difference to me how I treat them at all, but I do notice a difference in the way that I get treated by those patients. And I do know, how they're paying for their hospital stay or how they're not paying for their hospital stay. And just after, a few years of being there, you kind of can notice a pattern. And I don't treat them any differently, but I definitely get treated differently by them.
Okay, tell me the truth now, Nurse Michelle. Have you ever had an Arab patient walk in with a suitcase of cash?
Yes, I have. A few times, actually. A few times. And
nailed that one, didn't I?
Yes.
No, I've actually I had heard stories like that, but I just didn't know how common they were. So it's actually happened to you more than once?
yes, yeah, a few times you'll have patients who come over for care, and they generally come in with a big entourage and some suitcases full of cash for sure.
Now, what percentage of the patients you see typically, what percentage are patients who are going to pay either through insurance or out of pocket or out of a suitcase of cash if they speak Arabic, and versus those who are uninsured, nothing? And I'll come to the illegal immigration question in just a moment. But right now, if you had a guess of your patients, what percentage of them are paying? What percentage of them are going to be covered by the taxpayer?
Roughly, I mean, it's just a rough estimate here. I would say maybe 10 to 15% are paying with actual insurance that they pay for every month, and I would say the vast majority of them are being paid for by taxpayer money.
So you're saying as much as maybe 75, 80, 85% of the patients you see at your hospital, which is a large, well-known hospital in a major American city, as many as 80%, maybe more, are not paying a thing and are going to be taken care of at the cost of the taxpayer.
Yes.
Folks, it's a disturbing story, and there's even more, and I'm going to check to see if I can have Nurse Michelle on for another session. But right now, quick break, and you are listening to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show on the Blaze. My website, youneedarabbi.com. Don't forget to go there and subscribe to my free weekly email thought tools, and be sure to send me a note letting me know how you feel about the show. Quick break, back for another segment in just a moment with Nurse Michelle Jeffries, a registered nurse with an amazing story to tell. She's really held me quite breathless since we started chatting together on this little remote outpost in British Columbia. Don't go away. Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking with the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show here on The Blaze. And I really enjoyed meeting the nurse and talking with her. And I've got one more segment with her coming up next. But first of all, I wanted to let you know some of the results I had to my question. I had asked you to go to my website at youneedarabbi.com and to click on the Contact Us tab, thereby enabling you to shoot me an email, which I promised you I would get. And I'd asked you specifically how comfortable you were with the format we're using here. Essentially, a 2-hour format broken up into 8 close to 15-minute segments. So there's a lot of material, and it's fairly dense and it's fairly long. But my assumption on a podcast is that you would interrupt it. You know, you wouldn't take it in one long swallow. You'd break it down into smaller doses and take it as you felt like it, you know, while you were commuting or while you were exercising out at the gym or whenever else. Listening would be a very good use of time. And I did get some responses, and they were gratifying. I'm going to share with you the response. I think this is all the responses I've got. I may be mistaken on that, but it's certainly a good representation of them. So I'll just read them to you quickly. This is from Kyle, who writes, "Thank you, Rabbi Lapin, for your wonderful podcast. I enjoy every minute of it, and I learn a great deal from it. You present your point of view so plainly and lay out your arguments so skillfully that I hardly realize that the podcast is almost 2 hours long. God bless you and keep up the good work." And I wonder, again, if I got any really negative ones, frankly, I'd read those to you as well, because first of all, if they're just abusive, then I think they're funny, and you probably will too. I didn't get any abusive ones, but I sometimes get abusive mail after radio broadcasts. And secondly, if they're negative, I usually learn from them, and I told you I did want to hear the truth of how you felt about it. So as it turns out, there are no real compelling negative ones, but it's a mixed batch. Pamela writes, I recently found out that you're doing a podcast on the Blaze Radio Network. I was thrilled to hear this and even more thrilled to listen to each and every one of them. I've been a long-time student of yours and have purchased every audio CD in your store. By the way, that would be our store at www.youneedarabbi.com. Pamela continues, I enjoy listening to them often as I travel back and forth to work. I wanted you to know that I enjoy your teaching so very much. I feel blessed beyond my worth to have a rabbi like you. Thank you so much. Look, this stuff is like massaging me with warm butter, you understand. This is not painful for me to read these at all. Here's Nancy who writes, just finished listening to the podcast today and heard your request for feedback on the length of the program. Definitely not too long. I thoroughly enjoyed listening and would be sad if you shortened it. You are one of my favorites. Thank you for all the time and effort you put into sharing your wisdom. And as I said, that was Nancy. And here's Michael from Florida, writes, enjoyed and learned from your podcast, Rabbi. Guess I'm a Catholic guy with my own rabbi. Perhaps this exists and I've missed it, but having a quick table of contents for what items you're covering that day helps me come back to it sometime in the future rather than have to sift through multiple shows. And, okay, that is a very, very good idea. And Michael, I will tell you this, that if you go to soundcloud.com, search for Lappin, you will get to my page where you will find all the current podcasts up. Right now they're 5, 6, 7, something like that. And each one does have it's not a table of contents, but it is a list of topics covered. But I will try. I don't fully understand whether you mean you wanted a written table of contents or you wanted me to start off the podcast in segment 1 talking about the topics that will be covered in the rest of the podcast. I guess I could do that if it would be helpful, but that is, I'm going to try and get some clarification. Maybe I'll email you back asking for clarification. But Michael's a CEO of a company in Palm Harbor, Florida. Dawn lives in Hayward, California, writes, just a quick note to let you know, I think the length of your podcast is perfect. I thoroughly enjoy listening and always look forward to the next one. Okay, and for those of you getting completely fed up with this narcissistic, self-indulgent exercise of me listening to people loving my work, you can jump ahead for a minute or two, and that should take you safely past the remaining letters, each one of which I shall diligently and eloquently articulate in detail. Here is Mark from South Bend, Indiana. Dear Rabbi Lappin, I'm a huge fan of all aspects of The Blaze, and I was glad that you started doing a weekly podcast. You asked for comments on whether it could be shorter, and my vote would be yes. I think somewhat shorter would be better. The reason being is that about the same time your podcasts are available, the podcasts from other people are available as well. They come out at the same time. And then there is the regular Saturday lineup on the Blaze Radio, starting from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m., and I try never to miss that. So you can see my weekends are pretty full. Regardless of what you decide to do, I will continue listening either way. Thank you. And that's from Mark in Indiana. Thank you, Mark. That sounds like an awful lot of listening you're doing. And based on the sort of responses I'm getting, I think I'm going to continue this format for another a month or two or thereabouts. And I think by that time, I'll be able to get a very good sense of how it's working for me and how it's working for you. So I just don't want to be premature in making a change. I just want to keep it as it is for a little while until I can see whether the numbers reflect satisfaction. And that's really the bottom line, isn't it? That's how I'm really going to be able to tell how things are. Thomas writes, I think the longer podcast length is perfect. You're able to really develop multiple topics and give them the time that they really deserve. This is quite a refreshing change from the typical attention deficit disorder culture we seem to have descended into. Keep up the great work. And that's Thomas. Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate that. And he's absolutely right. And this is evidenced by something I've mentioned in the podcast and before, which is that scenes in older Hollywood movies, if you go back to the black and white era, in fact, I mean, frankly, all the way up to about 1960, when, as you know, I believe many, many things changed. I think it was an epochal milestone in American history. But up to that point, scenes, when, in other words, the director would leave the camera running for sometimes 2 to 3 minutes of a long, I mean, that was not an unusual scene length. Today on both movies and television, scenes have dropped to about 15 seconds on average. And that this has an effect on people's attention span, particularly young people, a great deal of whose intellectual, emotional, and mental development is shaped by large hours, many, many hours they spend watching television or watching a television production on the internet. It's pretty serious. Then we've got that's pretty much it, actually, isn't it? I think that takes care of much of the feedback. Yeah, I seem to think there was another bunch of it as well, but I will save you the torment of more of that. But as I said, you can be quite sure that I myself did read it all and enjoyed them all and took it all very much to heart. And I have had other conversations with Nurse Michelle, and the ones I recorded and I'm sharing with you on the podcast was the one you just heard in the last segment, and we're finishing off in the next segment, basically dealing with very much the question of basically what the healthcare business looks like to a professional insider. And I've spoken with emergency room doctors, and I must say, in general, my impression is that if you really want to know what's going on in a hospital, you want to speak to the nurses. And it's understandable, right? You know, doctors are seeing many, many, many patients, whereas a nurse is dealing with, a floor, or part of a floor. It might be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 patients, depending. But she's also eyes and ears. She's there all the time. This nurse I was talking to in the earlier segment was 12-hour shifts. Hard work, you know, on your feet for most of 12 hours, and dealing with human beings who, even at their best, are not at their best, if you know what I mean. And then she's also, as she explained and will explain more, dealing with a part of America's population that represents a massive problem. And whether they're illegal immigrants or not illegal immigrants, they are people who have not been acculturated into American values. And these things are very noticeable. In terms of sort of American values, don't play your music so loud that it impinges on the lives of the people near you, whether it's in your car with the windows rolled down, or whether it's out of your apartment window, or whether it's from the boombox you're carrying on your shoulders, although nowadays most people are beaming that audio directly into their ears with earpods or earplugs. And but that would be some of it. Another one is you stop your car at a crosswalk to let somebody, a pedestrian, over, or maybe it's not even a crosswalk, and the person saunters in a very insolent fashion. Have you ever seen that? They're deliberately taking as long as they possibly can to walk across. Okay, that's not an old-time American value. American value is consideration, concern. You're living with other people, and you're part of a community of other people. And somebody stops you, you acknowledge their inconvenience on your part by stepping to it, moving right along and striding across to whatever extent you're capable of doing so. How's about pleases and thank yous? Okay. Acknowledgement, again, on the road. Somebody lets you in to a line you're merging in, or somebody stops to let you turn into a wave of acknowledgement. These things lubricate human interaction, and they make you feel warm and positive towards your fellow human beings, which is what makes things work better. And all of that, these things are terribly important. And these things that I've been talking about are the minor symptoms of it. On a far deeper level, we have such things as deferment of gratification. We have such things as self-discipline. We have such things as impulse control. these are part of the American values. And how do I mean this? Well, if you go back to the textbooks that young students used to study in American schools, and I'm not talking, you don't have to go back as far as the Northwest Ordinance that sort of essentially set up a vision of public schools in America. You don't have to go back as far as that. You can go back to the 50s and 40s and before that. You will see many, many, many American kids grew up learning to read on the McGuffey readers. And if you don't know what the McGuffey readers are, do yourself a favor, and when you have a few moments to reflect on life in America, where we've been and where we're headed, go and look up the McGuffey readers. You'll be astounded that these constituted the major part of teaching young students to read literature. Now, the way it's developed in public education today is that reading is just a technical skill, and there's no discussion, there's no thought given. And I've read some of the minutes of educators' conferences where no thought whatsoever is given to the idea that values are being transmitted, as well as just the vocabulary and grammatical skills that come from learning to read properly. And so, as a result, they've decided that as long as the kids are reading, it doesn't matter what they read. And they give kids sheer garbage to read in schools today. The so-called young adult novels. They're horrible, horrible things. But all of this is designed to ultimately to change the value structure of America. And so the very concept of deferment of gratification, you don't do what you feel like. You control your impulses. You discipline yourself that you have to do your homework before you play, that work comes before leisure. These things that have made America and make any civilization function are absolutely crucial. And whether or not a lot of people in a society is an asset or a drawback depends very much on whether the people have been, if you like, acculturated to Western civilization is what it's all about. Anyways, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Nurse Michelle. I want you to hear another quick and final segment on some of the things that she encounters. And then when we come back after her, there was another part of a conversation I had with her, and this had to do with, she wanted to get married and the kind of men she's meeting. And I decided to compile a list of things that women should know before they invest a single evening in dating a guy. There's certain things every woman should know about reading men. And I am going to disclose this here. This is immensely valuable, so much so you should start thinking of me as the Mother Teresa of podcasting. I'm really going to be doing you a favor, coming up right after the next segment with Nurse Michelle. Stay tuned. We're back, everybody, and thank you again for being tuned to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show on the Blaze. I am very fortunate to have run into, as we run into all kinds of people up here cruising during the summer in British Columbia, Canada, but we've run into a young woman, Nurse Michelle Jeffries, who works in a large city hospital in a large American city. And because I've asked her to be very candid about what she encounters, I agreed to not disclose the city or the name of the hospital she works in. But again, thanks so much, Nurse Michelle. It's been great getting to know you and spending some time with you here. And in the last segment, almost in passing, you alluded to constant trivial demands being made of you by patients who are not paying. Whereas you indicated that those who have insurance, those who are paying, tended to be polite and grateful. You said you got a lot of trivial demands. You got a sense of entitlement, rudeness from people who are going to be walking out without paying a penny. What sort of things do you find going on?
Well, I think that one thing is that when people are paying for their own insurance, you understand the value of something when you pay for it. When you're given something for free, I feel like you really don't understand the value of it, and that's in all facets of life. But it really has come across very clear to me in the hospital, because I do find that patients who are on their own insurance are very aware of how much things are going to cost and the type of effort and work that the nurses and the doctors and all the staff put in for them, because there is a sense that they are paying for part of it, and they tend to value what they're paying for and demand a certain level of value. But I have noticed that they are quite happy with what they get. They're very understanding, very grateful, very appreciative. When you're given everything for free and you don't need to have any concept of how much things cost, and there's no concept of the value of what's being given to you, patients tend to get very demanding. And I have had patients who are in the hospital who on their own account, they will tell me that they don't really need to be there, that they've come in because they've run out of pain pills, or they've come in because they need, a place to stay for a few days. They tend to be more demanding, and let me just clarify that I'm more than happy to do anything for my patients, but like I mentioned before, it's a very busy hospital. I have 6 or 7, sometimes 8 patients on a very busy day. A lot of them are very acute patients, very sick, and there's just no understanding that if you're busy with something else, it's unacceptable, and the demands can be as minute as, helping them figure out what channel of TV station, they're looking for. They want their bed sheets changed twice a day, which I'm more than happy to do, provided I have the time and provided another patient doesn't need me more at the moment. But there's just a very a strong feeling of entitlement and demanding, and not understanding that there might be patients who are sicker than them, or patients who need something more than they do, or that refilling their water jar might not be, at the top of my priority list at this moment. Like I said, I'm more than happy to do it, provided that another patient doesn't need me more, or that I have the time. But it can get very disheartening, and it can kind of jade you a little bit when you're really doing your best and trying to take care of people to the best of your ability, and there's just no gratitude, and there's just a sense that you're just there to serve them, and not understanding that there's a value in a service being provided.
You are aware at the same time. Do you also have a sense and awareness of who is an illegal immigrant? I mean, I'm quite sure you're dealing with a lot of people. The government euphemistically says of color. I'm sure you're dealing with a lot of people who are not born in the United States of America. Do you have a sense of what proportion of the people you're dealing with have no right to be in the country at all in the first place?
Yeah, I am aware of it. A lot of patients are there for quite some time, and I do become friendly with them, and people disclose a lot to their nurses. You spend a lot of time with your patients. So I would say that I typically am aware of people who are not in the country as legal citizens.
And again, an approximate percentage of all the patients you see, guess at an approximate percentage of people who are there and are illegal?
It's a good question. It would have to be a very rough estimate. I'd say on a weekly basis, if I'm working three 12-hour shifts a week, I'm running into 2 or 3 patients a week that are illegal immigrants, I would say.
Now, you said something a little earlier that went by me, and I've been thinking about it. Wait a second, this is very, very hard. You spoke about patients who don't leave, patients who... I'm not sure I understand that. What happens ordinarily in my experience is that the doctor says, well, you're okay, everything is good, you'll be discharged this morning. Goodbye. Why? What do you mean when you say that there are patients who could be with you for a very long time and yet are not sick? What does that mean?
Well, hospitals and the whole medical industry are very, very tightly controlled environments with a lot of rules and a lot of laws in place and legalities about how the rights of the patients, I would say. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of legislation, a lot of laws there to protect the patients, I would say. And one of the things, and I'm not precisely certain exactly why or which law in place stipulates this, but hospitals are not allowed to discharge patients in a way that would be considered an unsafe discharge. So if you have a patient come in who's homeless, and they come in off the streets, you cannot then discharge them back to the streets. That would be considered an unsafe discharge. And the discharge process is very convoluted. It takes a lot of people. I mean, they're paying salaries for social workers, and they're paying salaries for patient care coordinators to have the job of making sure that the patients are discharged somewhere safe. We have patients coming in from shelters who will then refuse to go back to that shelter. And they will stay for sometimes weeks more at a time on the taxpayer's dollar. And then it's really just a hotel because they've been considered medically safe for discharge for a week or two at this point. And they're, eating 3 meals a day and having their sheets changed daily and TV service and phone service. And they will stay until they agree that they are being discharged where they want to go, because you also Medicaid allows you to refuse your discharge. So if you are considered medically safe for discharge by the doctor, the patient has the right to then say, I don't consider myself safe for discharge. And they are then allowed to stay for an extra 24 hours at a minimum. So if you decide you don't want to leave, that's one way not to leave. If you decide you don't want to leave because you don't want to go back to the shelter where you were came in from, that's another way not to leave. And if you're homeless, you're definitely not leaving until we find somewhere for you to go that you also want to go to. And I think these laws were put in place with very positive intentions. I can completely understand why they were put into place. And it's to protect the patients, but it ends up really draining the system because people know how to use the laws to their advantage. And they're in a busy metropolitan hospital on a floor with 50 patients. Half of them could be just sitting there totally healthy, taking up bed space from patients who really need the space because they don't feel like leaving.
You mentioned, while we were chatting earlier today, you mentioned the fact that you get rated by the patients. And so give me some examples of that and how that works and ways in which you've been rated.
Well, this is the part that I feel the most strongly about, and it's a part that's really just recently coming into play with the new medical system in this country. But a lot of the hospital's reimbursement is now based upon patient satisfaction surveys. So the patients leave and they're surveyed about how satisfactory they found their stay in the hospital. And then those surveys are then collected, and the hospital gets rated in different areas. And if we're not rated highly enough, we don't get reimbursed. This is now the way that insurance is working in America. It's part of the way that it works. So I've seen some of these surveys, and we go over them. And some of the questions will be, did the nurses respond adequately to your pain? Did the nurses manage your pain appropriately? And like I mentioned before, I think this probably came from a very positive place of when patients are in pain, they need to be responded to adequately and appropriately and quickly. You don't want anyone to be in pain, but it's really being taken advantage of right now because I've had patients who, there's only so much the nurse can do, right? The nurse isn't writing orders, and the nurse isn't deciding on her own volition how many milligrams of morphine to give to somebody. But the nurse, once the order's in place, the nurse should then act quickly and give the patient the medication that's been ordered for them. So patients will tell me that I'm doing everything I can for them. They'll say, I know you're doing everything you can for me, but I didn't want morphine, I wanted Dilaudid. And I know when we get their surveys back, it's gonna be rated a 0 on that. We get the majority of surveys we get, because we go over them every month, rate the nurses as 0 in the area of pain control. And I think the question is written poorly. I think the idea of reimbursing hospitals based on what type of drugs we give out to patients is a very poor idea. But we end up, it feels useless, kind of the work that I do, because no matter how hard I work, if the patient wants 10 milligrams of morphine and I give them 6, we're going to get rated very poorly. And I find that very, very disheartening. And I've had patients, tell me straight to my face, I really like you, you're doing a great job, but no offense, I'm going to be complaining a lot about you, because they get what they want when they complain, because doctors tend to be very fearful of patients writing bad reports, because a doctor that has a lot of patients complaining about them, you don't get reimbursed if patients are not happy. And instead of keeping patients healthy, I find that we're keeping patients happy. So they're happy and they could be dying, but they're not healthy. And this is the way that the system is going. I've seen it changing a lot in the last few years compared to the years before that I've been working. In the last few years, it's really a lot more about, are the patients happy and getting what they want? Well, getting what you want isn't necessarily what you need, especially when you're very sick. And that's been a disheartening sight to see over the last few years.
Gosh. Does the system feel sustainable to you, Nurse Jeffries? In other words, do you look at it and say, look, for all its flaws, it's kind of working, and there's no reason why it can continue like this indefinitely? Maybe we'll work some improvements along the way. It'll get a little better here, a little worse there. But basically, this system is sustainable. What is your feeling on that? It is or it isn't?
I would say it definitely isn't. And I don't know what the solution is. I'm not a political professional or any kind of expert in policy or anything like that. Far from it. But I would definitely say that this is not sustainable. You have a percentage of the population paying for other people in the population, which I understand is necessary, because you need to care for the poor of your society, but the system is being taken advantage of, and it's being taken advantage of to such an extent that there's no way it's sustainable. There's just not enough money, there's not enough resources, and frankly, the nurses are getting burnt out. I've seen doctors getting burnt out. It's just very difficult to take care of populations who you just feel are draining you. And it's definitely not sustainable.
In closing, because I know you have your seaplane to jump into soon, the sort of closing advice for anyone who's unfortunate enough to have to be in a hospital, what are the best tips you've got for somebody to have to sort of make their nurses happy and want to help them? Definitely a good idea to make the nurse happy, but nurses are by the most part, for the vast majority of nurses go into the profession because they really do care about people and they really want to take care of people, and they have good hearts, and nobody goes into it for the money or the hours, because I can tell you that both of them are not worth it. But people go into it because they really want to take care of people, and if someone really needs you and is really sick, then you'll have chances are that 9 times out of 10 you'll have a really great nurse there to take care of you. And nurses are really the backbone of the whole medical system. I mean, I would say that the doctor spends maybe at a maximum 15 minutes of the day with the patient, because they've got a lot of patients to see, and that's just the way the system works. But your nurse is with you for 12 and a half hours a day. So they're really the ones who are noticing things going wrong first, and they're the final gatekeeper for your medications and noticing medication errors that are sometimes, ordered the wrong dose, and the nurse will be the one to catch it. And so I would definitely say that nurses are the real backbone of the hospital, and not so much advice for patients coming in, but advice for policymakers and for the country in general is they're really going to have a hard time retaining good nurses if this system keeps up, because it's very, very draining. It's very draining for nurses, and it's something that I know a lot of my coworkers feel as well. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been real fun talking with you, and thank you for spending a little time with our listeners on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Much appreciated. Travel safely, and God bless you. Take care of yourself. Folks, we'll go to a quick break, and we'll pick up with the show in just a few minutes. In just a few moments. We're back, the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, where I, your rabbi, reveal how the world really works. And one thing One thing about the way the world really works that never changes is understanding male-female relationships. As a matter of fact, if you undertook, let's say you're raising children, if you undertook as a parent to teach them only 3 things really, really well, you will have fulfilled every possible obligation as a parent. And after that, the ballet lessons and the karate lessons and the extra classes in remedial breathing are all completely jam on the bread. The 3 things, the 3 areas you have to thoroughly and completely make sure your children understand: money, okay, what it is, its spiritual dimensions, where it comes from, everything about money. Number 2, everything about male-female relationships. And number 3, everything about faith in God. Cover that, and you're done. And so a very important 1/3 of the Rabbi Daniel Lapin syllabus for effective childhood education is male-female relationships. And so what are some of the things that are so necessary and so important? And I'm going to be sounding fairly negative about single guys in this segment, but please don't see that as in any way derogatory, because I like guys. I am one. As a matter of fact, I'll probably have to do a sort of corrective segment showing you just how much I think of men. But right now I am talking about women and single men, and I'm talking about particularly single women who are dating. And you see, here's the trouble. I talk to a lot of these women, and interestingly enough, it can really jaundice you against men. I will tell you that there is a large category. I don't have numbers, okay? To some extent, this is anecdotal, but I talk to a lot of people, and when people come up to me after appearances or lectures, I promise you, I'm always available. I'm very often, and to the chagrin of my wife or my handlers or the people who sort of have the obligation to get me to wherever I got to be next, I'm very often literally the last person to leave an auditorium where I've appeared or to leave a church where I've spoken, because I hate missing an opportunity to talk with anybody who wants to talk to me. I talk to a lot of people. And I will tell you that I'm absolutely convinced that there is a large segment of women who become what they think of as lesbians. Now, in reality, there is almost no relationship between lesbianism and homosexuality. This I don't want to devote right now this segment to that particular topic, so I won't dive into that at length. But if you think about that, essentially the absence of penetration is an absolutely crucial dimension, number one. Number two, there is also a crucial aspect to the sort of temporariness of things. And what I mean by that is that I do believe, and if you just look at the large number of women, many, including many celebrities, by the way, who are notable lesbians, they come out and yes, they like women, and then they shock everyone and disappoint their former teammates by getting married to a man. It happens all the time. There's even a category called lesbians until graduation, LUGS. Doesn't surprise me, doesn't puzzle me, doesn't baffle me in any way at all. Women are so badly treated on the campus. And yes, women allow themselves to be abominably abused on the campus. Yes, the hookup culture is real, it's alive. The Tinder culture, all right? And if you don't know what Tinder is, you are leading an enviably sheltered lifestyle. All of these things have contributed to the extent to which women are abused and to which women allow themselves to be abused. No question about it. Let's not ignore the culpability that rests upon women in this area. Bottom line is, it makes absolute sense to me that so many women just decide to have nothing to do with men anymore. And then what happens is they graduate, they get away from the toxic campus culture, and they get into the real world and they start meeting men who are holding down jobs and achievers and who are performing, and all of a sudden they discover, hey, these aren't the retarded adolescents we've known for the last 4 years. They're actually real men here. And then all of a sudden the lesbianism is forgotten. And that's, I've not yet heard of male homosexuals until graduation, but I have encountered many lesbians until graduation. So all of that to explain why it is that that this particular segment is devoted to women who have dealt and are dealing with more than their fair share of adolescence. And by the way, male adolescence has nothing to do with age. Male adolescence, I've met 40-year-old male adolescents. I really have. And this is one of the reasons that almost every culture has an initiation process for men, not for women. Even Judaism has bar mitzvahs. And because we're dead scared of explaining to young girls, hey, you know what? Boys and girls are different. There's a reason boys have bar mitzvahs. Bar mitzvahs are not occasions of lavish and extravagant gifts or life-size effigies carved of the 13-year-old pimply adolescent in chopped liver. No, a bar mitzvah is supposed to be a very serious spiritual kick in the pants that'll jar him all the way up his spine to his head, that will help to dislodge him from the seductive world of adolescence and turn him into an adult. That's what a bar mitzvah is supposed to be. And whether it's an initiation rite of the Maasai tribesmen in Kenya, or of Arabs, or of Native American Indians, or as we say up here in British Columbia, Canada, First Nations, whoever it is, they always had these initiation rites for men, not for women. Does that ever surprise you? Like, what happened? Oh, they're just patriarchal, masculine-dominated societies. They decided not to share this wonderful thing. Look, most guys who go through a real initiation rite would happily have forgone it, right? Excepting, as I say, in contemporary American Judaism, the bar mitzvah has become an outrageous and extravagant opportunity for parents to show off to their friends, and for the young man to flaunt the absolutely nothing that he's achieved and his appalling ignorance of the world and everything to do with it. 13-year-old boys are not supposed to be celebrated. I mean, all they've done is stay alive, and even that is more a tribute to their parents than themselves. No, it's meant to be a very serious process, and in many parts of Judaism, again, it's a minority of the American Jewish population, but in some parts, notably the parts that take the Torah more seriously, it is not just a party. It is a serious spiritual encounter that does leave the young man significantly altered for the better. But without any process that converts a young male into an adult male, he will remain an adolescent. And, of course, in modern American culture, where the university is no longer a place to prepare for life, but it is a place to continue partying, and, in fact, there are universities that recruit on their reputation as party schools, all we're doing is really destroying American masculinity, and in the process profoundly imperiling the future of the United States of America. And so you women out there, and I've given you ample time to make sure that young women in your life, or any women seeking marriage, have been able to get hold of this podcast or are able to listen now. I will again stress that I certainly I'm not disrespecting males in general here. Remember, I am one. But my instincts lean towards protecting females. That's not just because I'm fortunately blessed with 6 wonderful daughters, some of whom have had the opportunity of sharing time with Susan and me on our boating trip in British Columbia. But it's also because that's part of Western civilization. When ferries are imperiled in the Bay of Bengal, nobody ever hears women and children first. Again, I want you to understand that when men went down with the Titanic after making sure that women and children were in the lifeboats first, please don't think that's a universal human instinct. It isn't. It belongs exclusively to Western civilization based as it is on the Bible. separate discussion. If that sounds shocking and outrageous to you, then we need to make sure you hear the podcast devoted to the linkage between Western civilization and the Bible. But when I say that my instincts lean towards protecting females, that's not just as a father, but it is as somebody who believes in Western civilization as being the only form of civilization on the planet. Oh, cultures? Sure, hundreds of cultures, but civilizations, that's the one. And so guys in general have to learn to take it on the chin, and so, gentlemen, here it comes. I do get consulted very often by young women who are in the process of meeting a potential spouse. And again, this is not due to any inherent skills or any prophetic insight I may or may not possess. No, this is only because I am a teacher of ancient Jewish wisdom, and that is what equips me to help young women have the right questions and understand those answers. So let me give you three quick examples of the kind of questions that, as a young woman, you want to ask a guy long before you waste 6 months of your life going out with him. Long before that. And so a very early one is, so what sort of work do you do? The answer, okay, interpretation, are you ready? Any response starting with the word well means unemployed. Okay? When a guy is asked, so what sort of work do you do? And he doesn't immediately launch into an enthusiastic and passionate sounding explanation of what he's doing, he's probably unemployed. So be very cautious of any answer that begins with the word well. And by the way, you'll hear it in television as well. You hear politicians being asked something by a television pundit or anchor or commentator or interviewer, and the politician begins his answer with the word well. Be very cautious with such an answer, because well basically means I need time to think. Okay, here's a second question. Question number 2. Are you ready? How close are you to your family? How close are you to your family? Okay, if you hear an answer that sounds anything like this, it's trouble. Are you ready? Here's the wrong answer you're going to hear from many guys. How close are you to your family? My mother suffers from depression. My dad has always been a workaholic. My sister has issues. So, da-da-da-da-da. You know what the interpretation is? I'm an egotistical and insufferable idiot. So, be cautious of guys who every member of their family has a problem, except the guy you're talking to. He's the perfect, watch out for those. So if somebody is incapable of talking positively about his parents and about his siblings, don't walk, run to get away. It's not worth a waste of time. Are there exceptions to this rule? Yes, probably 0.001% are exceptions, and it's nobody you're likely to meet, so just treat this as a rule, please. Third question. How do you feel about God and faith? Look, I don't care what your position on God and faith is, but you'd be crazy not to ask that question. Okay, I'm speaking to women. Here's the answer you've got to be aware of. The answer that says, I've always felt that religion was an intensely personal matter, da-da-da-da-da, etc., etc. I've always felt that religion was a personal matter. Okay, what that means is, I will fake an interest in God to retain your interest in me. You get the idea, right? And the very biggest question of all, the real issue that you need to know, apart from these three, the biggest one, That'll be coming up in the very next segment. Meanwhile, please visit my website. It's the place where you can subscribe to my free weekly emails, Thought Tools. It's the place where, yes, you can write to me, and I value that very much. I cherish all the responses I get. And it's also the place that you can explore my store for further resources in which I delve far more deeply into many of the topics I discuss on the podcast, but in a way far more profoundly than it's possible to do on a public podcast. So, for instance, talking about men and women, a very crucial resource I produce is something called Madam, I Am Adam, Decoding Marriage Secrets from Eden. And that you can explore, read more about, or even hear a little bit about on the website. Go to the store at youneedarabbi.com or rabbidaniellapin.com. A quick pause, and when we come back, the last really big issue that any woman would be crazy not to explore and be very careful of with any man she's considering spending any time with at all. Be right back. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin, back with you on the Blaze the Podcast, the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. My solemn mission, revealing how the world really works. And we're talking about the way the world really works, particularly in the area of male-female relationships. And in the previous segment, I discussed 3 important questions that any woman contemplating spending any time with a man, I'm not talking about, heaven forbid, 6 months of your life. I'm talking about more than one date, frankly. And so I've covered those 3, but here is really one of the biggest, okay? And that is a man who has not yet cut the ties with his mother. Look, any guy who is still tied to his mother in a particular way that I'll try and explain is somebody who is no way ready to form a tie with you. And so you really need to understand what the nature is of his relationship to his mother. If it is a relationship of emotional and needy dependence, and yes, there are men like that. And he will reveal it by using almost childhood terminology as he relates or talks about his mom. And of course you should ask him about his mom. Of course you should try and delve and dig, because it's in talking about his mother that he's going to reveal so much about himself. And so what you want to find out very much, very, very clearly, is the extent to which he remains emotionally needy in terms of his mom. Is his mom still supplying some of what every child needs, which is a sense of love and a sense of connection and a sense of belonging and a sense of groundedness and a sense of a place to call home, as it were, all of which is obviously not meant to exclude a close and loving relationship with his mother. Very positive. But I'm talking about something else, and you'll recognize it when you see it, once you've been alerted to it and you know what it is, which is a less healthy dependence on his mom. What am I talking about, and where does this derive from? Like everything else I've been telling you about, it's from ancient Jewish wisdom, which has been the subject of my obsession for my entire life, and or at least to date, I should say. And I will tell you actually the actual verse, because it's fairly well known. It's the final verse. It's the final verse in chapter 2 of Genesis. No, it's not. It's the second final verse. And it's, therefore, a man must leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Okay, now, sequence in the Hebrew scripture is very important. It's really very important indeed. So I want you to notice two aspects of the sequencing, and there's many more to talk about, but this is the kind of thing I would cover in much greater detail in the resources on my website than I feel is appropriate to do on the podcast. But enough information to help you through the topic we're discussing in the segment is definitely something I am going to include. And so the second last verse of chapter 2 in Genesis, therefore shall a man leave, okay, who? His mother and his father, or his father and his mother? Not sure? Check the text. And he shall cleave to his wife, and then they shall become one flesh. In case the language didn't immediately clarify itself to you, they become one flesh means sex, sexual intimacy, physical intimacy, right? So that's at the end of the process. I'm just saying. Now, let's take a look at that sequence. Therefore, God is really laying out here, and whether, again, for many of you, and I fully understand and appreciate it, for many of you, the source of the information I impart is utterly and completely irrelevant. So bear with me a little bit, because I know there are many people for whom the biblical and ancient Jewish wisdom origin of a lot of this stuff is not only interesting but also valuable, and perhaps makes the information more useful and more valuable. And so, first of all, what we've got now is a description of an incipient embryonic relationship, and it says that before there can be any cleaving to his wife, and certainly before there can be any sexual contact or connection, there first of all has to be a leaving. The man has to leave his father and his mother. Okay, first question is, now, why do you suppose there is not a parallel? Right, in this podcast I said that there is technically, in reality, there is no bat mitzvah. It's an artificial creation on the part of parents and congregations and rabbis and synagogues who are just scared of telling young children the truth, which is young ladies don't need a bat mitzvah or an initiation to adulthood any more than an NFL player who has not had his arm broken needs a cast. You do not put plaster casts on the limbs of people who haven't broken them. You do not put initiation rites on people who don't need them. You see, ever since they were little girls, my daughters were looking at bridal magazines. My daughters were like 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. The house was littered with bridal magazines. It's a miracle I didn't break one of my limbs slipping and sliding down the hallway on a carpet of bridal magazines and pictures. Now, do you think my son ever looked at a bridal magazine? I doubt that he has to this day. Guys do not think of marriage. Girls start almost at birth. Not quite, but almost. And so little girls envisage weddings. They do. They love weddings. They love attending weddings. Little girls envisage their own wedding, and they see the staircase they'll walk down, and they'll see that their wedding dress in enormous detail, by the way, and next to them they'll see a tuxedo, a very smart tuxedo, with an oval hole where the face goes. They don't actually see the face, other than the fact that they know he's good looking. But everything else about the marriage is there. It's very important to young women, very important. To guys, a whole lot less so. And so guys have to be initiated to move towards marriage. There has to be an acculturation, because ordinarily it's not going to happen at all. It just doesn't, and the evidence is, take a look around you. Take a look at what we euphemistically call the inner city. A dysfunctional part of America, which has nothing whatsoever to do with color, by the way, and I've covered that extensively in the past. The dysfunctionality there is basically family shattering. And the culprit, not color, government. Of course. because they have interfered with the economic dimension of family. And when the government interferes with the economic dimension of anything, chaos and confusion are inevitably the result, let alone after chaos and confusion comes absolute calamity. And so in reality, for a young man to move towards marriage, which is absolutely essential, he's got to have the impetus. But the obstacle, he hasn't yet left his father and his mother. What does that mean? What do you think leaving your father is? The answer, economic dependence. That's what that means. Ancient Jewish wisdom explains that therefore shall a man leave his father, he must acquire economic independence. Look, ladies, this seems to be almost so obvious it barely needs saying. But if the guy has not yet acquired any form of economic independence or is demonstrably on the path to that, let's imagine that he's in his last year of apprenticeship as a machine tool operator. And so right now he's making very little money, but guess what? Next year he's going to be doing very well indeed. Or a guy is in his last year of college, not taking middle period Etruscan pottery as a major, but he's taking science, engineering, mathematics, technology, computer topics, things that at the present time in the American economy actually offer a potential of a job. So right now he's a student, no problem. But somebody who has no economic independence, plus no plan, and not just a plan, because a plan is indistinguishable from a daydream if it doesn't have a schedule attached. Nothing, no plan, no schedule for achieving economic independence. Move on, ladies. Don't run, don't walk, run, get away, waste of time. Therefore shall a man leave his father. Yes, he has to leave the sense of economic dependence. And by the way, most women don't have the faintest idea of how utterly traumatic that can be for men. Talk to guys about it. If you're on a date and you're short of conversational material, say to the guy, tell me about what it was like to when you first got that feeling that you're going to need to find a way of making money in your life. Because up till then your dad took care of everything. What was it like? And most men, most good men, will tell you with total recall, because most guys do remember that moment, that period, and sometimes over the course of weeks or a couple of months, where it begins to dawn on us, wait a second, we got to do it ourselves. And most honest guys will recount it. You'll almost see the terror in their eyes as they relive those traumatic moments. That is what leaving the father means in the second last verse in the second book of Genesis. And then after that, he's got to leave his mom. That's the next thing. What is that about? Okay, well, remember I said earlier that we do not find a parallel verse that says, and by the way, therefore shall a woman leave her father and her mother. Doesn't say that. Have you wondered why? Why does the second last verse of chapter 2 of Genesis just say, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, then he'll be ready to cleave to a wife? How come it doesn't say, and therefore a woman must leave her father and her mother, and then she'll be ready to cleave to her husband? Reason? And like I said, because women are born ready to leave their fathers and mothers and cleave to their husbands. That's why in Western civilization, women take and embrace the names of their husbands. They are delighted to become a Mrs. Jones, even if their original name was Felicity Winterbottom. They're absolutely delighted to become Mrs. Timothy Jones and to renounce the Felicity Winterbottom name. Sometimes they'll be Mrs. Felicity Jones. But bottom line is, women are by nature ready to embrace a man. And this is why it is that on the high streets of so many small American towns that still retain a link to the past, you will see many, many, many storefronts that say Brown and Son, or Smith and Son, or Greengrocers, Jeffries and Son, whatever it is, or Sons. And you'll find publishing companies. A company that I've been associated with is John Wiley and Sons. It was a New York publishing house. How often do you find a company name that says, so-and-so and daughter, or so-and-so and daughters? Almost never. Why is that? Well, let me explain that as soon as we come back in the next segment. You wait right there. Welcome back to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, where your rabbi reminds you that the more that things change, the more we need to depend upon those things that never change. And foremost among those things that never change are male-female relationships. And that's what we're talking about. And I was reminiscing with you on journeys, road trips through the heartland of America, how often you find businesses named, Smith and Sons, or Thompson and Son, or Jones and Son. But you will drive many, many miles before you see any storefront labeled Jones and Daughter, or Thomas and Daughters. Very, very rare. Why? Well, it's obvious. The reason is that Mr. Jones's daughters are now married to somebody else's family. And so their involvement in a business would more than likely be in the business into which the family in which they married to is involved, not their father's. That's the way of the world. That's how God created men and women, or, for those of you who prefer, that's how men and women evolved through a lengthy process of unaided materialistic evolution. So, bottom line is, either way, whichever way it is, the reality of it is that women don't need to be taught, acculturated, initiated into leaving the families into which they were born and embracing husbands and the husbands' families. We do it, they do it all the time. And that is, there's so many indications, so many pieces of evidence that illustrate this intrinsic reality. And so, on the general rule that in the Torah there are no directives for things that we would do automatically. Almost every directive is for something that goes against our natures, against our instincts, things that are difficult to do. For instance, there's no rule at all in the 5 books of Moses that says, Jews, please be sure to eat 3 solid meals a day. I'm the Lord your God, and I direct you. You must eat 3 solid meals a day. You don't have to do that, because other than in oppressive times and in periods of terrible oppression, Jews can be counted upon to eat 3 solid meals a day. Under normal, happy, healthy circumstances, malnutrition, not a big problem among American Jews. And so anything that is told as an instruction in the Torah is something that doesn't come simple. For women, leaving their fathers and their mothers is relatively easy and straightforward. It's not a big traumatic thing. But for men, it can be massively traumatic. Therefore shall a man leave his father. That's right, financial independence. Make no mistake about it, it is difficult. And, boys can sometimes be 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. I'm talking about before adolescence, before puberty, when they realize that they're going to have to do this. Very often, for most men, it is early. That young guys realize that financial reality is important and that they have to do it on their own. It's very difficult. Sometimes fathers even have to be a tad cruel. They have to sometimes say to their sons, well, that's it. This is as far as it goes. you're going to be on half from here onwards, or you can stay with us, but you're going to have to pay rent. It's going to be less than market rate, but and sometimes you have to do that because it's kicking the fledgling out of the nest. And I have watched, because of some of these wonderful video cameras that have been placed by various nature organizations at nests, I've actually had the thrill of watching on video as mother birds actually nudge their fledglings out of the nest and force them to take those few first frightening moments into flight. And during the Lapin annual family boating trip, which is coming to an end, so soon you will no longer be tormented by inadequate audio quality and noises on the outside like seagulls and other things. But we've actually seen a number, we've been very fortunate. We've seen a lot of seals, mums and pups. That's what you call baby seals, or pups. And we've actually seen the mother seal sort of teaching the baby seal how to go about things, and she's also got to and they do it instinctively, of course, but teaching the baby seal with a combination of sort of maternal compassion, but also a desire for the offspring to achieve independence, because that way is the only hope they have of surviving and not becoming the prey of predators like orcas, killer whales. And all of that sort of goes on around here. But parents sometimes have to do that. And it falls to fathers with their sons. And so that is an absolute requirement where the father has to make sure that his son leaves him in that sense. Obviously, there's no departure of, it's not an ending of the relationship or anything, but it's specifically financial. And guess what? Susan Lapin is waving her arms at me in the saloon of this boat here, which normally I can record the podcast in solitude in the studio, but over here we are close together, which frankly is part of what we love about this trip, and I think it's wonderful for our marriage. Yes, Susan.
I think you may have.
Susan says she hears a contradiction. As soon as she said contradiction, I thought she was going to say that it's mother seals and mother birds.
Oh, that's true.
And what I'm talking about is fathers and sons. And the answer to that obviously is straightforward, which she knew as well as I do, which is it's one of the very big differences between animals and human beings. The role of the father in human beings is unique. The role of the father in animals is quite different. It's fleeting. And in fact, the father seal is nowhere to be seen in these British Columbia scenarios that we're enjoying, and the father bird is not involved in teaching the fledglings, but it is the father human who is teaching his sons to achieve financial independence. The contradiction Susan spotted was that I spoke about storefronts, that were Davidson and Son. And so, where is the economic independence there? Well, look, it's a wonderful thing to be able to work in your father's business. It's a wonderful thing to be part of that business, and for the business to be strong enough and viable enough and to provide an exciting enough economic environment for a son to go ahead and stretch his wings in that sense. And it's not a contradiction, because everybody knows that as wonderful as it is to work for your father, it also is very difficult. And I've often said that working for the worst father is better than working for the best stranger. And that's an aphorism of mine, but it's obviously not true 100% of the time. There are wonderful things about being able to work for a father and to work in a family business, but they are very tough things as well. I have counseled and do counsel many smaller companies on succession issues, how to make certain that that strong entrepreneurial founders are able to convey responsibility and independence to their sons. Because, guys, if you're in a business like that and your son or sons are working in your business, if you do not allow them enough independence to stretch their wings and to do their thing, even though it's going to end up moving the company in a direction different from your visions. It's not going to endure. And so that's a whole different topic, and it's a very real one. But a great deal of genuine wisdom is needed for father-son businesses to thrive. The wisdom is needed on the part of the father primarily, and on the part of the son, patience and humility. You may realize or may see that your dad is not proficient in Instagram, pictogram, Periscope, and everything else in social media. Possibly not. But if he's got a thriving business that he's built up, maybe from what he got from his father, who knows? Your grandfather may have started the business, and if so, you're very fortunate. And you have to realize that although your father may well lack certain modern technological familiarities, at the same time, he obviously understands how the world really works because he's running and built a successful business from before you were born. Is there a legitimate role for you to take it into new and vitally important directions? Obviously. But it's got to be coupled with humility and patience. And on the part of the father, there, you've got a good son. And by the way, what many fathers wisely do, and I recommend it in many cases, not all, but many, is that before you bring your son into your business, you have him work for somebody else. Have him experience working for somebody who's not related to him. And only after he's acquired some of that experience does he then come into your business. I think that's important in the majority of cases. But of course, for you, the tough thing is now being willing to relinquish some control, relinquish some autonomy, because you don't really want a son who's nothing but an order taker. You don't want a son who has no entrepreneurial zealousness at all. So you're going to have to stand by and let him do things. And you are probably going to also have to let him make mistakes. And you have to remember that unsolicited advice is almost never welcome. These are all things that you need to do. At any rate, back to the second last verse of chapter 2 in Genesis. Therefore shall a man leave his father, we've covered that, and his mother. All right, we understand that the financial independence must come first. The emotional independence from his mother has to come a little bit after that. There are men who don't break free of their mothers. And I don't mean that derogatorily. I don't mean that mothers have become these cartoonish, freakish caricatures of mothers. No, not at all. There are people whose mothers they are adults, whose mothers haunt them in a way, and who will sit in chairs at $150 an hour, counselors, psychologists, and so on, and they talk about their mothers. On and on and on and on, they talk about their mothers and what their mothers did to them and the things their mothers did that made them the way they are. Trust me, if the guy you're dating, ma'am, is spending a lot of money at a therapist talking about his mom, you need to run in the other direction as hard and as quickly as you can, for sure. That's a definite indication that this man has not yet left his mother. As to whether he left his father, that's a separate topic we've discussed. But right now, a man must leave his mother, and only after that can he cleave to a wife. Only after that is he ready for marriage. And only after all of that will it make sense for them to become one flesh. There's a lot of material. Ancient Jewish wisdom devotes an enormous amount of material to what it means for a man to be ready for marriage. Much, much less on what it means for a woman to be ready for marriage, because she's almost always ready for marriage. Almost always. I'll tell you that with a great deal of marital counseling and premarital counseling, I've got to tell you, I can't think of too many cases. I think maybe one or two come to mind, but there really are not a lot of cases where guys tell me, we've been dating for 4 months, 5 months. I really want to start moving towards marriage now, but she's not interested in marriage. How many times do you think that happens, right? Hardly ever. But overwhelmingly, 99.9% of the cases I've been involved in, it's the woman saying, you know what, we've been dating for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Tragically, there have been cases where they say be for 2 years, which should never be allowed to happen. And every time I bring up marriage, he gets unhappy. He says I'm pressuring. I get it all the time. Women say, I can't help it. I see couples out with a baby, and I'm drawn to the baby. And John, or this guy I'm dating, doesn't want it, and he sort of gets uncomfortable when I cuddle the baby. Yeah, of course he gets uncomfortable, because he has no interest in getting married. You know why? Because he hasn't yet left his father or his mother. But that then becomes really one of the most important things, ladies. In addition to the 3 questions I told you to ask in the last segment, make absolutely sure that you explore the extent to which he has fulfilled the second last verse in chapter 2 of Genesis. Has he left his father, and has he left his mother? My website again, youneedarabbi.com, or rabbidaniellapin.com takes you to the same place. Love to see you there, love to hear from you, and above all, love it that you're listening to this podcast. Let me know, will you? Let me know you are. Let me know what you think. And do that by hitting the Contact Us tab at rabbidaniellapin.com. Quick pause, and then back, and I'm going to tell you, I told you earlier, this isn't an attack on men. I'm going to tell you some of the great things about men, okay? That coming right up here on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Stay tuned. Reminding you that the more that things change, the more we need to depend upon those things that never change. Yes, I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin, thanking you so much for being part of this podcast. I watch the download numbers avidly, almost obsessively, some might say, but I have no other way of knowing whether my work is effective. One of the stories on which I was raised by my teachers of ancient Jewish wisdom was the man imprisoned in a dungeon, and he found a crank protruding through the stone wall of his dungeon, and he started turning it, and he turned it and turned it, and he once asked the jailer, what is the crank attached to? And the jailer said, well, it goes through the wall to the other side, and there's a playground there, and as you turn the crank, it turns a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel, and your cranking powers up toys, these fun games that little kids ride. And he says, if you could but hear through the thick stone walls, you'd hear their laughter and their joy. Well, year after year, the man turned that crank from the moment he woke up until the time he went to sleep at night. And then there was a change of guard. And a new head of the prison took over, and new dungeon directors and new jailers. And they told him something else, and they laughed at him, and they said, we don't know what you were told, but that crank goes nowhere. It ends on the other side of the wall. You're doing absolutely nothing at all. And the man just dropped dead. The disappointment was too unbearable. Look, we need, all of us, we need for our work to be meaningful. And when I say all of us, I'm going to be very honest with you and very candid, even if it means being politically incorrect, because you do not need me to affirm untruths, and that is that this is very different for men and for women. Men who are engaged in no work at all or meaningless work suffer terribly and become less men. The same is simply not true for women. It isn't. And that would be a different topic for another time. But for right now, if in any way you doubt what your rabbi has just said, then I urge you to study some of the freely available medical figures on sexual dysfunction linked to economic stress for men and for women. Totally different. There could not be a more different set of statistics. In other words, put it briefly and effectively, men who lose their jobs take a beating in the bedroom. Men who lose their jobs become, in many, many, many cases, less men in its most brutal context. And women who lose their jobs, zero effect. And if anything, and this may be a statistical anomaly, although I don't think it is, in some studies actually show a slight improvement in sexual health on the part of women who lose their jobs. So please don't let people tell you nonsense, and don't buy into the stuff just because it's politically acceptable, because that's a cowardly way of going through life. The truth, even if difficult to swallow, is far more useful at any rate. And my goal is to be useful to you above all. And so men and women, men absolutely need meaning in their work. Look, everybody, women certainly also enjoy doing meaningful work. There's no question about it. People become nurses, like the nurse I interviewed, become nurses largely because they want to do something meaningful. Got it. Okay. But let me talk a little bit about men now. When I spoke in earlier segments about things women should look out for, beware when they're meeting single men, it sounded a bit as if I was really down on men. That's obviously not true. I love women, particularly the 7 to whom I'm related. My wife and 6 smart daughters, beautiful daughters. Oh, and again, look, there's pluses and minuses of doing the podcast aboard the motor vessel journey in the pristine and beautiful waters of British Columbia. One of them is that Susan, we spend a lot of time together when we're on the boating trip and when our children are with us, and that's wonderful. It's absolutely fabulous. But Susan did just interrupt there by saying that I should also include granddaughters. Okay, fine. But look, I love women, and I'll tell you something else. I don't care whether they are wives and mothers or whether they are plumbers or politicians. And I'll tell you that cities that have well-dressed women on the streets, whether it's lunchtime or in the mornings or shopping, whatever it is, but that's a different sort of city. And I'll tell you that in the Soviet Union, you never saw attractive, well-dressed women on the downtown streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg or anywhere. It never happened. You don't see it in Cuba. And I will tell you that one of the very promising things about China, or if you are worried about Chinese ascendancy in the world, one of the very disturbing things about China is the very large number of well-dressed, attractive Chinese women you do see on the streets. It's a very positive thing, and there's no question that it adds a healthy sense of well-being. And so, yes, I love women, and I do consider them to be full and vital partners in any civilized society. Yeah, partners with men, of course. And so with that as a sort of caveat and disclaimer, I want to reveal a timeless truth and a permanent principle without arousing fiendish feminists into a frenzy of fanaticism, okay? Let me say it. I'll say it once, and I'll say it clearly. Skyscrapers, highways, oil refineries, sewage treatment plants, power stations, bridges, and yes, all the other necessities of civilized life exist. You know why? Because men built them. That's right. I don't mean that men designed them and engineered them and found financing for them, although that is also mostly true. I mean that men blast boulders out of the way of highways. They pour foundations on freezing cold mornings for skyscrapers. They weld steel structures in scorching heat. They climb hundreds of feet up in the air on flimsy scaffolding swaying in the wind. They dive deep under the surface of the sea in order to seal up oil wells. They build and test engines and turbines producing ear-splitting noise, and so on and so on and so on for all the other crucial activities that attract almost no women. Hey, understandably, that's fine. I'm not one of those people, oh, why do these fields not attract women? It's perfectly obvious. It's not hard for me to understand at all. I'm not bothered by it. And frankly, I wouldn't advise any young woman asking my opinion to go into deep sea diving. I wouldn't, for obvious reasons. There is a remarkable woman. I find her, almost everything she writes, to be interesting, well-read, well thought out. Her name is Professor Camille Paglia, and I may be pronouncing the last name incorrectly. Do you know, Susan? I'm not sure if the G is sounded or not, but I sound it P-A-G-L-I-A, Camille Paglia. Here's something she wrote, and it's so it's so eloquent and incisive. Here are her words. If civilization had been left in female hands, we would still be living in grass huts. And Camille Paglia is not, she's not a conservative, or if anything, I think she's probably on the liberal side of things, but she's truthful. And that is so much more important than where you stand in politics. Be truthful. If civilization had been left in female hands, we would still be living in grass huts. To quote a woman who in this case is certainly was known as on the conservative side of the political spectrum, she was actually a libertarian, she was raised by Jewish communists, and so in the spirit of rebelling against her parents, which many young people do, she became a conservative. And anyone who's never read Atlas Shrugged, for instance, is really missing out on something. To get really excited about it and to sort of see it as the Bible of life, you have to be a teenager for that. But never to have read the book at all leaves you undereducated. The book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and she has in Atlas Shrugged, the successful industrialist Hank Rearden says the following: Dagny, there's another G in the middle of a word, but I'm pretty sure that one is not silence. Danny? No, I don't think so. Hank Rearden, what was that? Susan laughed. Hank Rearden in Atlas Shrugged has Hank Rearden saying, muddle up word there. Anyway, here's what Hank Rearden says. Dagny, whatever else we are, it's we who move the world, and it's we who will pull it through. Right? And so, I mean, no thoughtful or fair-minded woman will argue with anything that I've said so far in this segment. As a matter of fact, I think I'm not pushing it too far if I say that most women are moved by men who move the world. I think most women are moved by men of ambition, men of achievement, and it doesn't mean you have to be an artificial superhero from Atlas Shrugged like Hank Rearden, but men of ambition, men who have a plan for success and who follow the plan, men who have a vision of what they are doing with their lives. I think those men move women. So it's worth recognizing that that the word man actually means something. Masculinity means something, and it's a massive problem. I think massive problem for American society, and this would be true for any society. A massive problem where men are no longer men, and we've done this to ourselves. We've done it by the abandonment of Judeo-Christian values. We have left men with no guidance whatsoever, and by a society in thrall to the doctrines of secular fundamentalism, the utter obliteration of values such as postponement and deferment of gratification and impulse control, we've produced eternal adolescence. And I'm speaking about men, because it's when men lose their masculinity, when men stop being men, that the society of which they're a part becomes seriously imperiled. Seriously imperiled. Something that began about 30 years ago in many countries around the world, was the sex and gender selection of babies. Now, this had been happening in one way or another for years. Feminists around the world were horrified when, in the 70s, they began to discover that in Asian countries it was frighteningly common for infanticide to take place. Female babies were killed. And later on, as technologies became available, abortions were disproportionately performed on female babies. I was very friendly with an OBGYN doctor on the west side of Los Angeles, whose practice was almost exclusively well-heeled women of the Beverly Hills, Westwood, Santa Monica, parts of West Los Angeles, most of them professional women, and he assured me most of them women who would think of themselves as feminists. He did many, many abortions until he discovered that the figures revealed that the majority of abortions he was being asked to do was on female fetuses. And that's when he began to question everything. And around about this time, he was also finding faith and becoming attached to God in a personal relationship as a practicing Torah-observant Jew. And he stopped the abortion side of his practice, terminated it, to much anger and hostility, I must tell you, both within the profession, in the hospitals that he was licensed to work in, and among his patients. Very, very much hostility on this front. There's a little bit more about the topic of men and abortions that I want to wrap up on, and we'll do that just as soon as we get back here on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Hold on just a moment. Here I come. Revealing how the world really works, your rabbi, Rabbi Daniel Lapin. And yes, about 30 years ago, it became evident that nations in Asia were aborting a disproportionate number of female fetuses, and in many cases were actually committing infanticide, again, disproportionately on girls. Why is that? Something I touched on just a little bit earlier in the show was that there are many storefronts around American towns that still show that sons join their father's businesses, but not daughters. Daughters go into another person's family. And so to many of these cultures, not based on Judeo-Christian principles, where the role of women, even daughters that are going to join someone else's family, are a vital part of your life, that vision is not there. And so daughters are worth less in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, because sons become part of your social security system. Daughters become part of someone else's. And particularly in Asian countries that imposed one-child rules, punished draconian penalties and punished with just sheer brutality. In cases like that, if couples were being allowed only to have and raise one child, they wanted it to be a man. They wanted it to be a boy child. And very, very bad things happen. One of the results of that is that there is actually now a girl shortage in some Asian countries. And that means that very large numbers, particularly you're talking about, India, over 1 billion people. That's 1,000 million. In America, the population is 300 million. In Canada, it's a tenth of that, about 35 million. Japan, 125 million. But India and China are both over 1,000 million. Okay, and so gender disproportions become very serious, and it means hundreds of thousands. No, I'm not sure the figure's hundreds of thousands. I'm not going to give the actual number, but very large numbers of men are destined to never get married. Very big problem. Traditionally, a problem like this is solved by going to war, because typically in war, you are trying to improve yourself economically and sexually. You're trying to get women and economic resources. That is what war brings, at least when successfully executed. And so we certainly ought to be aware of latent social disquiet in cultures and countries that have a very real female shortage. In a Judeo-Christian tradition, we welcome daughters just as much as sons. And while, yes, it obviously is true that sons do remain part of your family in a way differently from daughters, as a matter of fact, in Judaic principles, in ancient Jewish wisdom, a man, is obligated without end to respect of his mother and his father. And it's not just a sort of emotion. It comes along with very practical implications of things that a man needs to do for his father or his mother, even if he's married. But a woman's obligations to her parents once she's married diminish. They change. Now, it is true, of course, most women will feel a closeness to their daughters, even after their daughters get married, that they don't feel to their sons. It's a very different thing. But in spite of that emotional connection, it is a very real thing that your daughters do become part of someone else's family. They don't retain the same relationship with your family that your sons do. Nonetheless, they are of equivalent value. Why? Because it builds connections to other families. Your closeness to other families is enhanced, and that's what builds community. And with community comes connection and communication and collaboration and cooperation and ultimately creativity on an economic level. And I can only tell you that in the Jewish community, I couldn't even begin to count the number of instances I'm aware of in which a person's business dramatically grew because of a relationship with the family into which his daughter married, a family he didn't know before until his daughter met the young man, and then the parents met the parents, and closeness and friendship developed. And out of that flowed real significance. It's an important thing. I'll also want to point out, and again, if you don't mind, back to ancient Jewish wisdom here, when I want to point out that, interestingly enough, in the Bible, God provides no information. I'm talking about the first couple of chapters of Genesis. Zero information on the ingredients that went into making the sun and the moon or the stars, or from what God built camels and cows and kangaroos and cats. But he does specify the material from which he constructed the human being. It was earth. Isn't that interesting? Right? Nothing else. Nothing else does God give the recipe or the ingredients, only for human beings. And this link between human beings and the earth has significance, not just in burial, from the earth we come, the earth we return. No, not just that. But early scholars of many parts of Western civilization retained this concept of a human-earth link by deriving the word human directly from the Latin word for earth, which is humus, H-U-M-U-S. So in Hebrew, a human is an Adam, and the word for earth is Adamah, ground. And so Adam came from Adamah, or human came from humus. And so we've got the Spanish word for man is hombre, and again, listen to the word. You know the MB connections. Hombre is H and M are the operative consonants in that word, retaining that link to humus, the HM connection once again. If a man is a real man, then he's not arrogant and high and mighty. A real man is a down-to-earth man, is he not? He is seen as a humble human, or a humble hombre, right? What happens if you bring somebody too much down to earth? That would be called humiliating him. And once again, it's putting him down, too far down. If you put him even further down, you kill him, and that's called homicide. Again, human, HM, humus, earth. and you put him in the ground? How about if you take a victim of a homicide out of the ground for a medical examination? You exhume him. And all of this flows from the Lord's language, which is Hebrew, that links Adam and Adamah, as I said, found in the first few chapters of Scripture. And it just becomes really important to understand that what we're being told here is the importance of, well, let me put it this way. There's one more distinction between animals and humans, and that is, it says explicitly that that God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And of course, lions and llamas also have life to them, and they breathe and they have lungs, but nowhere does it say that God breathed this breath of life. The breath of God's spiritual vitality sort of exerts a subconscious pull in us towards heaven. In much the same way that if you sometimes see at parties where kids are given helium balloons, after a little while some little kid loses the grip on the string, and that helium balloon, once it is no longer tethered, floats off up into the atmosphere and eventually bursts as the air pressure diminishes and the balloon swells, finally bursts and falls to earth. But we human beings also have an ability to lose contact with earth if we're not tethered to reality. If we're not constantly reminded that we are of the earth, we have the ability of sort of losing touch with reality. Have you ever seen academics? Have you ever encountered professors or people who operate on such an intellectual area and sometimes begin to take inordinate pride in being super intellectuals? Have you ever noticed that sometimes they're unbelievably stupid in the ways of the world? That's right. There's such a thing as being too lofty and floating away like that balloon until you burst. Real men are constantly reminded that we are of the earth. Yes, of course it's important that we remember that we're imbued with a pull towards our Creator. But that can also be problematic if it's not matched by a parallel and equal connection with reality. And that's why you'll sometimes hear expressions, and they're complimentary expressions, when people will say about a guy, oh, he's got his feet on the ground. That's a good thing. What they're saying is, he's not like that helium balloon. Or they'll say about a woman, she's so down to earth. It's a good thing. It's wonderful. I mean, who wants to have a wife who's not down to earth? Right? A wife who's not down to earth can't budget, I don't even have to spell it out for you. It's so obvious. These people remember that they are of the earth. And that is why it is that whether you are looking to hire a person in your business, or whether you are a woman who is looking to get married, and this sort of takes us full circle, one of the things you want to know is whether the candidate is down to earth and has his feet on the ground. And again, and this sort of ends the advice to women of this podcast, if you are dating a man who's not down to earth, if you're dating a man who is, and again, overly intellectual, not connected to reality, not of the earth, please run for your life. And talking of being down to earth, I want to tip my kippah, as it were, to Pittsburgh Steelers linebacker James Harrison. Okay, you know what he's done? His kid's got a participation award, and he handed it back. He said, "No way." I was so impressed. He said he was taking away the participation trophies awarded to his 6- and 8-year-old kids until they actually earn a real trophy. He says, I'm not about to raise 2 boys to be men by making them believe they are entitled to something just because they tried their best. That is a great example of a man who is tied to the earth, who's tied to reality, has his feet on the ground. Yeah, there's the stupid participation awards. Have you heard about them? where in spite of the fact that life isn't always fair, and in spite of the fact that you can work your hardest and do your best and expend every ounce of energy, the fact is that sometimes things just don't work out the way you hoped or imagined. It's the way the world really works. But somewhere in the misguided way that American culture has evolved, they've got the notion that kids have to be raised in a cocoon of unreality. And there's no hardships and no heartbreaks, and you get a trophy for everything, for just being you. It's terrible. Absolutely horrible. And so what happens is that sports teams for kids have no losers. Right, the winners get a winning trophy and the others get an equally nice, same size trophy, by the way. It's called a participation trophy. That's another example of being disconnected from reality, not being a real hombre, not being a real man. Tremendously damaging, tremendously destructive, and everything that here on this podcast that I, your radio rabbi, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, am privileged to try and combat and to try and present you with all the intellectual ammunition possible in order to defeat this growing tendency in the world in which we live. Value you very much. Appreciate you listening to the show. Visit my website at rabbidaniellapin.com. And yes, go forth and have a prosperous and healthy week. God bless till next time.